Hi guys, in this video I cover interfaces in more depth. I talk about constants, static methods, default methods, and private methods. If you're not familiar with interfaces yet, please check out my other video, which gives an introduction to interfaces in Java. Let's get started with constants. Here I have an interface named A. In Java, interfaces can have static constants. A static constant is created using public, static, final, a data type, an identifier, and an initial value. Here I declare a constant named min and I initialize it to 0. I add a second constant named max and I initialize that to 10. Now any constant or any variable in an interface will automatically be public, static, and final. So I can use public, static, and final, and I can drop these three keywords. And so max will still be public, static, and final. So min and max will both be static constants that are publicly accessible. I can access these using the name of the interface, then dot, and then min or max, the name of the constant. Now here's an example. Let's say I have a variable named value and I initialize it to 3. Value might be set using user input, or it could be a result of a computation. And let's say I want to check if the value is below the maximum constant defined in A. I have a condition that checks if value is less than A dot max, and if value is below A dot max, I output a statement value is below A dot max. Now running this will output 3 is below 10. Here you can see how I access the constants using the name of the interface and then the name of a constant. And you can see that I accessed max, and max is still public, static, and final. Now let me create a class called SumClass, and I have this class implement the interface. So it implements A. A will automatically inherit both of these constants. So here what I can do is, instead of A, I could also do SumClass.max. So this class will have also both of these constants. And so I can access these constants either by the interface name or by the class name. Now let's move on to static methods. An interface can have static methods, and the static method is declared using public, static, and then the return type and the name of the method. Here I call it method A. And method A outputs static method A. Now this method can be called using the interface name, which I have as A, and then I call method A. Now running this program a second time, it will call the static method, and the static method will output static A. So the program flow will be in the main, it will go to the method, and then output this statement. Now public here is optional. If I don't have public, any static method will always be public. I cannot drop the static keyword. If I drop it, the compiler would assume this is an abstract method, because any method declared is by default public abstract. So I need to have at the minimum the static keyword here to mark it as a static method. Now let's move on to default methods. Default methods we have to approach in a different way. Imagine you have a library or a framework with an interface, and that interface is used in many places. Many people maybe use your library or framework and they implement that interface that you have. Now after some time, maybe you developed this framework or library a year ago or multiple years ago, and now you want to add some new feature that requires all classes that implement the interface to have a method implemented, a new method implemented. We cannot simply add an abstract method to the interface because that would throw a compile error. So if I do here void method B, this is now an abstract method, we can see it gets a compile error. So if many people implement that interface, for everyone that implements it, it would break their code. So this is not ideal. This is where default methods come into play. Essentially, a default method is, in quotes, an abstract method that has a default implementation so that people can choose to provide their own implementation at a later point, but it doesn't break their code initially. Now, default methods are implemented using the default keyword and then having an implementation here. This could be system out default method B. Now, default methods are always public as well. So I could add public, but again, the public keyword is optional. Now, I cannot call this method on A because it's not a static method. I also cannot call it on the class level. It is an instance method that has a default implementation. So what I need to do is create an object of the class. Let's call it obj new sum class. So I now have an object of the class that implements the interface. And on the object, I can now call method B, which is the method with a default implementation. Now running this code will give me a third output here, default B, which is the statement that is executed when I called or invoked method B here. And I can see my class doesn't provide an implementation and my class didn't break. When you start out creating new interfaces, never use default methods. That's really not the purpose. The purpose is really if you have a working library that many people use, and now you have no other way than providing some functionality to the interface, that you have a way to provide a default implementation to it. Now finally, let's cover private methods. There are two types of private methods for interfaces. One is on the class level, the other one on the instance level. Let's check out the class level. So for a class level, it would be private static method C. Should be a void, a return type here. And here I output again private method C. Now, private means it can only be called within the interface. And it's static, so it can only be called in a static context. What private methods are for is if we have a static method that is very large and we want to break it down into small chunks. So we can have multiple static methods and then call them from a public static method. So here I could call method C. Now if I'm running this program again, when I invoke method A, it will output static method A, which we can see down here. And then it will call the private static method C, and it will output private method C, which is the line here. So both these lines were outputted as part of the public static method call on method A. So private methods or private static methods are really if we want to break down public static methods into multiple methods. Now there are also instance methods, which are private, void, I call this method D. And here I output private method D. So essentially it's the same idea like a static private method, but a private method or private instance method is used for default methods. When we have a large implementation for a default method, we want to break this down into smaller pieces. And now we can call it from the default method here. So I call method D, and I run my program a bit. I expand the console. So I run this one more time. This one here was from a static context when I invoked method A. Now here I created an object of the class that implements the interface, and then I called method B. Remember that method B is the default method, and so it outputted this, the message here when it executed this statement, default method B, and then it called method D, which is the private method, and that private method then outputted private D. So these two are instance methods. The one is default public, and the other one is a private. So again, there are two private methods, one on the static level, on the class level, and the other one on the instance level. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.